Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. I hope you had a good lunch. Here we are in the session afterwards, which is, as you probably read up there, about tin can, just to make sure that that is the one that you were intending to be in. Yes, yes, yes. Good. Righto. Tin can must be one of the most exciting developments in learning technologies that I can ever think of. It at last gives us the opportunity to think about applying real analytics to learner behaviours and learning programs, which will tell us, hopefully, what actually the learning achieved, what did it change, what's the new situation, instead of the ubiquitous but completely useless tick in the box. So I think we're all anxious to know, what can it do, how do I do it? And today we've got a speaker who can hopefully answer all those questions and more. Her name is Megan Bowe, and she is a designer and strategist for Rustici software. So please welcome Megan Bowe.
All right. Hello, everybody. As you may have noticed, I speak terrible English because I am from Canada's Fat Pants, or America, whatever you want to call it. So I'm going to talk to you about tin can. It's a wide and deep subject. I'm going to do a lot of the basics here. Get started with the basics. We're going to go into some details of the actual workings of it too. And then after this, I'm doing a workshop over in another room where we'll do really free form, come ask questions. And there'll be plenty of time for questions here too, because the questions are really more important than me talking for 3 hours. So, the Tin Can API. I think it's been interesting this week because I've never been to London before. So I've been without cell phone service, because I'm cheap and I didn't want to pay for the extra data plan. So wandering the streets, remembering how to use a map, using money that I've never used before. And while I could speak academically about how to use pounds and the denominations of coins, it's different having them in your actual hand. And that experience of walking around and using them, knowing what's in your pocket, things that you take for granted until it's changed. And that experience is where you really learn how to navigate a new situation. So this is one of the examples of why tin can exists. Because the old standards did not give any way to track any kind of experience like that. They weren't in context. They weren't real experiences. Well, they were real. You weren't like in another world, but they weren't in your work context or in your educational context. So we're going to start with SCORM, because everybody loves SCORM. SCORM does one very specific thing, well, in a number of ways, but it puts a course in an LMS and makes it play. In the 90s, the Department of Defense went out and said, we need to solve a problem. The problem is that we are paying for the same content to be developed for each LMS we're using. So the military would pay for the same content 5 times. They said, figure out a standard. They created ADL, the Advanced Distributed Learning Initiative, and ADL worked on SCORM. So we've had SCORM since 1997, and it still does this one thing of putting a course in an LMS and giving you 4 pieces of data. Now, the 4 pieces of data it gives you, which are finishing, passing, score, and the time spent, don't really describe what somebody really did, what they learned, what they can do with that knowledge they gained. So in 2010, they asked us to work on developing the Tin Can API, which I'll get into a little bit more in a bit. But SCORM has changed how it's really affected how we design for learning experiences. Because it does such a very specific thing, and everybody requires SCORM compliance, we've been told to make a package, put it in the box. So a lot of the things that are handed down to learning departments now, which leads back to the training ghetto Dawn was kind of talking about, is they just say, make a course on this. It's not figure out how to solve this behavior problem that leads to an outcome. So a lot of us have been put into this box because SCORM has had such an effect on the community. So again, course in an LMS tells you 4 things. So the government put out what they call a BAA, which is basically a research grant proposal. And they awarded it to my company, Rustici Software, and what they wanted us to do was figure out how you would track experiences with an API. It was pretty broad. We went out, we did the research, we came back with a combination of the activity stream specification, which is used by Facebook and MySpace and all those, you know, the ticker on the side of your Facebook page that says Megan liked this photo, whatever that is. That's one of the pieces we used. And the rest of the specification, we figured out how can it work with SCORM, how can it work in the existing infrastructure, and how can we make it communicate with all of the other technology out there that we haven't been able to use effectively because there was no standard to tie it all together in a neat way. So we took on this challenge in the corporate space, but there's, of course, higher ed has a different selection of systems, which is you have all of these systems in your organization. They're all in their little boxes. Sometimes you've had consultants come in to tie a few of them together, but the activities people are doing across them still tend to get stuck in those little silos. So we wanted to create a way to move data about the activities people are doing in each to one place. So for an example here, this is Joe. He may look like a peg, but he's a real person. No. He does customer support, but he's new to the organization. So in order to come in and do software support, you need to know the process that you do support by. You need to know the software you're actually supporting. You need to know the other systems that are out there in the organization to communicate with people, to find knowledge in different places. And there's also this concept of knowledge of the ancients, which the software may have been built in a specific way a very long time ago. And there are a few people in the organization who were there at the time and can answer the question of exactly why something works the way it does. So to teach Joe how to do his job with a series of courses, you could get the routine basic knowledge, how the software works, you know, screencasts of how-tos, that type of thing. But you don't know at the end if Joe can actually go support a customer using the software. Another example, Kira is a first grader. She goes to a dual language school. So Kira goes one full day in English, one full day in Spanish, and it alternates every day. They don't teach Spanish specifically, they teach math in Spanish, so it's full immersion. Her teacher could give her math lessons in a course format in Spanish, but still, knowing her score, knowing if she passed, you don't know if she's getting a bad score because she doesn't know the language very well or because she doesn't know the math concept very well. So there's a lot of pieces in there that are moving in teaching a kid subjects and a language simultaneously that can't be communicated in the 4 pieces of data from SCORM. So what TinCan does is it creates this language to share experiences. And it's a way for many systems to talk about the same experiences and activities. So if we go back to thinking about Joe, if we're collecting all of the experiences he's having, we're seeing him search the knowledge base, we're seeing him respond to support tickets, we're seeing him ask people questions and get answers in a social tool. Suddenly we can see how he's acquiring knowledge and how fast he is opening and closing tickets, how quick he is to respond to people's support requests. And we can tell if the information that's out there, whether formal or informal, is actually helping him get up to speed on his job and do it better. If we look at Kira, we can see where she is using her translator constantly. So she's working in a math application, plus she's searching the dictionary for terms, plus she is asking people questions around her. So the teacher can then start to say, oh, it's the language, not the math, or it is the math, but it's this one specific part. You know, they can get much more in depth in real time and support what's actually troubling her rather than just saying, she's no good at math, or she's no good at Spanish. So now I want to ask you guys a question. Think of a challenge you have either personally by yourself or within your organization. What is the one thing you're not tracking right now, or a couple things you're not tracking right now that you would want to track? Feel free to throw them out there. Mm-hmm. Definitely. Sorry, what was that? Mm-hmm. Yeah, which would be hard to track. There would be a number of pieces of data you could combine together and make a guess at that. But literal innovation would be It might be speed to market. It might be keeping up with competition. There's a lot of different metrics that can come in there.
Soft skills.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and soft skills also, you know, there's a lot of pieces we're going to figure out. So with Tin Can, you can track a lot of things. You can also dig yourself into a hole by tracking everything. So you have to be very specific about which pieces you really need to know about and what your reason for needing to know about them is. Because if you start tracking everything, one, you look like Big Brother and nobody likes that, you know. People will be uncomfortable. Two, without a point, you're going to end up with this pile of data that you could make say whatever you want. You really need to have a good research plan in order to get data that will help you in the end. Any others out there?
Less traditional, more informal ways?
Yeah.
Off-system?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like social tools, mentoring. There's a lot of different places, you know. I'll get into a couple of use cases where we're using things like sensors and other things to help add data about specific activities that matter to behavioral change.
I'd like to track the uptake on mobile devices.
Mm-hmm. So how often they're using the device, where they're using it, when they're using it, that type of thing?
How often they're using the learning on the mobile device.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm going to go on. Again, there will be plenty of time for questions after this, too. So this is the core moving pieces of Tin Can. There are activity statements. This is the I did this kind of model. So you've got an actor, you've got a verb, you've got an object. There's also these other pieces of data in here, which add a lot of information to the statement about what was important about the activity. The other part of the Tin Can specification, which is called Experience API by the government as well, so if you ever hear those, same thing. Learning record store. The learning record store is a repository that collects all the statements. Now, it's not just a database. It works in very specific ways, and I'll go into those later, but there's a collection of APIs that are involved in a learning record store. There's authentication, there's security. But we wanted to build something that made it easy for the data to come to one place and to be shared with other places, but in a secure way, so people weren't afraid of their data being lost or spilled or leaked to people they didn't want to leak to. So the learning record store is the piece that unites all of these systems. Now, this isn't magic. You don't just wave a wand and this happens. This is a long road, and this is a long-term play. What you're going to do is you're going to start seeing your LMS come on board, and suddenly it can talk to an LRS. You're going to say, OK, we have a wiki we use for collecting knowledge about certain things. We want to make that make Tin Can statements, and you'll add that support. You may say, we're using Jive, and Jive has an API that gives all of the data I would need. So you can pull from Jive's API and translate it to Tin Can statements and put it in the learning record store. You know, there's a lot of ways to go about uniting all of these systems. But like I was saying, it has to be done in a very strategic way. You need to have a reason for pulling these systems together. You don't just want to pull everything together. So the learning record store holds the data and moves it in a very specific way. It moves it to reporting and visualization interfaces. An LRS itself, according to the spec, does not say what the data means or which data to collect. So it's on the owner of the LRS or the company you're buying from to put this layer on top that makes sense of your data. And because you're going to be collecting very specific data for very specific reasons, you're going to need very specific reports to make sense of the data. So generic reporting is not something that may happen at some point and be really good, but for the time being, a generic report isn't going to get you very far. You know, you're going to see a word cloud. Like, how much do you know from a word cloud? OK, so portability of data. You've got the LRSs. They could be inside LMSs, like this diagram shows. They could be totally standalone enterprise systems. But the big thing about LRSs is moving this data in between. So you leave an employer. Theoretically, your data could move to your next employer. This is assuming the employer who owns your data wants to share that data with your next employer. So there is a question of data ownership, which there's a lot of bureaucracy around, and we're going to be pushing for our employers and our schools and everybody to start sharing. And that's something we get to a little later, but this is the big thing we wanted to enable, was letting this data move. If you think about adaptive learning systems, it would be really helpful to walk into that system and be able to say, these are the things I've done in history already. So you could bring your data there. It could say, okay, I recognize these activities. I see you know 3/4 of what's in here, so I'm going to start you there. This is a thing that can enable us to not start from scratch every time we approach something more formal like that. But without this data being able to move and having a common format for it, it's a lot of integrations to get to this level, and it's a lot of very custom work. So this kind of alleviates that in the long-term play of this future. So today, these are our adopters. There are many more coming on board. We just hit 1.0, April 26th of this year. The spec has been worked on for 3 years, but we were in beta all of last year working with a huge group in the community. There's about 50 adopters here, and the community group, who's actually been writing the spec with us over the last year, had, I'd say, about 30 really active members, and many of them were developers, but there's also a bunch of you here today who have helped with getting the word out, explaining it to people, all of these things. So it's been this massive community effort shepherded by the Department of Defense, but in a very open way that you would never expect from the Department of Defense, inviting the community in to help them write a spec to put out to the world under the heading of the Department of Defense. So here you'll see LMSs, authoring tools, social platforms, dashboards for K-12, games, simulations, scenario-based activities, learning record stores. So it's a huge range of applications who have already shown up. And many of the ones who jumped on board early were the applications that weren't learning management systems and authoring tools because finally they had a space to play in. They never had a place to work before. So here are some use cases, because we could talk about this all day long, and still without how people have used it so far, it would be a little vague. So Vanderbilt Medical Center, sorry, they were one of the first people to say, we want this, and we want it now. And they are functioning on their high-level business objectives for the medical center. So reducing readmission, reducing infection rates. And there's some very specific training from the Center for Disease Control in the US on how to do these things. If you go look up hand washing regulations, enormous amounts of information, enormous amounts of courses, data, all this. So Vanderbilt said, well, we need to do these things. We're doing all the trainings. We're doing everything we're required to. We just don't know how to affect it further. So we looked at the scheme of their organization. They had 3 different LMSs spread across the school. And I'm sure you guys have this, where there's multiple LMSs that have shown up. There's a rogue Moodle installation running around somewhere. You know, they come from strange places. Somebody gets a budget, buys one. But they had 3 that were separate. They wanted all that data in one place. That was their first step. So we're getting those to communicate not only new data, but legacy data to the learning record store, because it's kind of easy to translate SCORM data to tin can. Then we added a training delivery service. And the concept of a training delivery service is that it just plays the content. It pulls that piece out of the LMS that plays the course and makes it more agile. So suddenly you're not locked in this little locker of the learning management system. You can put that anywhere, and it will still communicate the data in. Then they said, we've got a bunch of other things we do in our university that matter, like these things listed here. We want data on those too. So classroom events could easily be just checking in that somebody attended a lecture. Informal learning, they've got social tools, things like that, and simulations, obviously. They rig up parts of that to make statements about what people were doing in it. So this is something we're still in the process of building because Tin Can is so new. But this is the overall plan for it. The analytics will come after we get most of these pieces hooked together, and then we'll start drawing these pictures of what's actually happening for them. So then, once all these pieces are in place, then they want to see if people are actually washing their hands. So they're going to do something like install sensors on the soap dispensers and look at time tracking. So they can say, this many people were working for this many hours on this floor. On average, they should have gone through X amount of soap. Did they? And they can actually get data on that. And then they could say, is our measurement flawed of how much soap they should have used? Or is there an opportunity to wash their hands that they're not taking? You know, there's some really interesting actual behavioral data you can start to pull out of this. So next one. This one is an engineering software. If you know AutoCAD, it's a little like that. Altair comes from a company in Michigan. And they have one guy in their learning department who's very strong technically. So he said, I want to know how people are using the software, because one of his main goals is to train the end users of the software and to teach them, you know, tools and tricks and that sort of thing. He's not entirely focused internally. So he started out small. He said, I just want to take this one panel in the software where people seem to have trouble, and I want to have it make a tin can statement every time somebody interacts with this panel. And it's for usability. It's to decrease, you know, in decreasing support costs, there's people actually reaching out to support and asking questions. And if it's the same question constantly, somebody still has to point them back to that article about the thing they're asking about. So he wanted a way to just make it so they could use it. So he took this panel here, and he had it make a statement. And this is opt-in right now in the software. You can say, yes, I do want to help with tracking of this to make the software better. So each time, once they say yes to that, they put in an identifier like their email address, and that's how the statements end up being made. But every time they do something in here, it makes a statement. So he can look at things like, here's the expected workflow of somebody using this panel. And then he can figure out what the other workflows are that people use with it. Because in his head, and in most of their heads when they're designing this, they have a way they think it will be used. But no matter what you design, people are going to find ways to use it that's better for them, or they're not going to figure out what was in your head initially. So he can suddenly see where things are unclear. He can start adding on-demand support for the actual buttons and clicks in here. You know, he can not be Microsoft's Clippy, but something better that actually helps people in a relevant way. So metrics is an interesting one. This one is focused on K-12. It's it replaces the clipboard in a classroom, you know, checking boxes of students here, they're in this group, they completed this assignment, those types of things. So it's on an iPad, it's an application, and it came out of a charter school in Rhode Island. And it's a blended learning charter school, so they try and balance the curriculum between classroom and, you know, sitting down in a classroom conversing and working with technology. So what we did with metrics was they had the pieces in there to track, you know, replacing the papers. So this person's here, these groups. They could see analytics on how the class was kind of functioning and grades in there. What we did was add real-time data flowing in from the applications that the students could be using. And this is a prototype. It's not in full use, partially because of student data laws in the US are very strict. So there's a few steps we took to get around those. There's a video of this on the Tin Can site and a couple blog posts. So if you want to see that, you'll see we're using codes to get around that and that sort of thing. In a full classroom implementation, it would be signed off by the parents, and then there would be less concern there. But what this does is the teacher can say, I have these students. And the applications can say, OK, we know to talk to this installation about what these students are doing. So as they're going through answering math questions, the teacher can, in real time, see how they're doing on the questions. They can say, oh, Sean looks like he is doing really well in math bingo. He needs to take a step forward now, rather than waiting until the end of the week for the test to realize that somebody was totally proficient in something and that Dawn here really seems to need some help. So seeing this data in real time in the classroom while the students are doing their work, the teacher can help them much more individually and at their level than they ever could previously with the clipboard or tests. So another health system. University of Michigan, they're more concerned, and this is more the actual training department there, who have to get new hires onboarded. And they also have to deal with things like compliance training for doctors and nurses who notoriously do not have enough time for that type of stuff. So, University of Michigan, we took their existing LMS because they couldn't get rid of the LMS. There was no way they were going to sidestep it. We attached a learning record store to their LMS. So it is embedded now. It'll track the courses that are inside of it. It will feed the reports that are inside of it. And they can also attach outside applications to it. So they have 3 initiatives that they're working on. The WordPress one is in place and working. The bite-sized learning one is in the process of being built, and the scavenger hunt one is planned. So what these are, the bite-sized learning implementation, they said, okay, we think these doctors really know how to comply. We don't want to sit them down for 2 hours on a course. So once a week, we're going to email them a compliance question. And they're going to answer it, or they're going to text it to their phone. So when the question is answered, it goes back to the database that stores it. It makes a statement saying they successfully answered the question or they didn't successfully answer the question. That goes into the learning record store. So taking just a small amount of their time on a regular basis, they can figure out, they can get all the checkboxes complete for compliance, as well as actually go give the people the information they need if they don't know what they're supposed to do for compliance. The next one with WordPress. So doctors and nurses have a ton of subject matter expertise, right? And the training department wanted to be able to give them more access to rapidly creating small pieces of content to get out to people in good time. Rather, in the current state, they'd have to go sit down with the instructional designer. They'd make something. It would finally get delivered after a long period of time. So what they did here is WordPress is fairly easy to use. A company that I'm blanking on the name of right now, but they built a Grassblade plugin for WordPress. You could go find it right now. It's called Grassblade. Grassblade lets you track what's happening on web pages, and send it back to a learning record store. So it's basically the piece that sits inside of WordPress and says you need to communicate to the learning record store. So in WordPress, they're building pages and quizzes. Grassblade is helping them collect the data, put it in their learning record store. And this allows the subject matter experts to get information out there really fast in these little pieces that are useful to people and well organized per, there are some standards for how they're created, tagging in specific ways, et cetera. The next one is the new hire scavenger hunts. And what happens with those is, in a hospital, there's a lot of places with a lot of stuff in them. They're notoriously very well organized because they have to be. But it's a massive place to learn, especially for a secretary or a janitor or a new nurse even, because things are a little different across different organizations. So they had been doing the training for these people on where you find certain devices or supplies throughout the hospital in simulations and courses and those types of things. They said, no, they need to go learn this in context. Sitting there at a desk learning about where things are is not as effective as going and seeing where it is in real life. So they're going to start putting QR codes and sensors on various places in the hospital so they can walk up to a cart and get information on their device about what's in the cart. And as they move things around, they can get more information about that. Then it can be checked off that they figured out this thing. Now they're on to the next thing. But it gives them a much more real way to interact with the things that they need to learn about in the organization. So this brings us to the concept of the personal data locker. So all this data is being collected about you. It can be shared between learning record stores. Why can't you own your own? Why can't your employer share what you've done with you? Why can't your school share what you've done with you? Why does it get locked inside of a learning management system? So in kind of showing how Tin Can could work and what ownership of data could look like, we built a prototype, which we call Watershed. It's very much a pre-beta prototype, but you can go to it right now and you can play with it. You can see your data moving. It's watershed.ws. And we've tied in Mozilla's open badges to make the point of there are a lot of specifications for interoperability that we can start to tie together in this new world. The problem with data ownership is that the employers have to decide what can be shared. You know, if you're working at Apple on the iPad 10, they do not want that data leaving Apple until the iPad 10 is out there, and then there's going to be a lot of confidential information that they're not going to want to put out there. So we all kind of have the task of, what would we want to collect about ourselves? You know, we need to make some of these decisions, and we need to start pushing employers for this data that we really should have some access to, and schools especially. There's no reason for a school to keep this data, you know? An employer, there's a lot of bureaucracy there. And this is kind of the map of what this could look like. So the vision for a personal data locker is that you can then say, I have this chunk of data that's relevant. I now want to go share it to this employer so they'll give me a job. Or I want to go share it to this system so I don't have to start from scratch every time. But in order to fill up a personal data locker, first we have to get over the hump of getting data into the personal data locker. So there's a lot of really exciting possibilities. It's just going to take a while. And the reason you should care about this now is because without this vision in your head of where you want to be in 10 years, well, you could make steps towards it now, but having more thoughtful steps made leading up to it is going to be better off in the end. So one of the big things we could start doing today when we're designing learning experiences is to start thinking in feedback loops. Because instead of thinking in ADDIE or these other acronyms that we all love, Tin Can gives us a better way to look at what people are really learning and doing, rather than going deep into, well, I think this will work and I don't know what they can actually do with it. So feedback loops can be really small. It might be, I have created this job aid for searching the inventory system. So I've created this thing. I want to know when they access it, and I want to know if their searches are successful, if they end up ordering a product or even finding something at the end of the search. So just that little feedback loop, suddenly you can say, okay, I see they've done all this activity in searches, they've found this many, they used to find this many before that. Now you can go back and say, well, the job aid is still lacking this one piece, or maybe it's great, and you can move on to your next challenge. But we have to think of the full feedback loop of that actual behavior we want to encourage. So this is kind of my map for starting, which with Tin Can, you're always going to want to start with a proof of concept type thing. You're not going to want to go whole hog, I'm updating all my systems right now. So you want to identify one challenge or opportunity that's important to you. Then you want to tie that to some outcomes. What's the ROI, if you want to say ROI? And what are the goals? Then you start figuring out what are the touch points that relate to those. So this is the behavior I care about. This is the outcome I care about. What systems do they touch in doing these things? Well, those touch points can be data that comes in that helps you prove or disprove whether that's working. And you're probably not going to get it right the first time. You have to test a few hypotheses before you get the right, before you start to figure out what really is working, what's really not working. And then iteration is really important. You know, you create it once, nothing's perfect the first time. And you know, this is typical of software development. It's typical of a lot of industries. So it's about figuring out what works and then making it better over time. So that is all I have. I am happy to answer questions. And like I said, there's also more time later today as well.
Right.
The vision of the personal data locker is a really powerful one and a great aspiration. But who do you think, or do you think anyone will drive it in terms of an organisation or an entity, or is it just kind of society, hopefully?
Hopefully society will drive it. I'll repeat his question in case you guys didn't hear. He was asking who will drive this personal data locker, organizations, business, government, private sector. And I think I would love for society to drive it. In fact, Ben Betts, who I think is running a session right now, his company is building a learning locker currently to do a real, not prototype version of a personal data locker. a lot of organizations I've talked to want personal data lockers, but internal to their organization, just so their employees can collect what they've been doing. So I think that's how it's going to start. But then people are going to start moving from job to job because people do not stay at jobs very long anymore. It's like 5 years average, I think. That's when I think the real shift is going to occur. But there are big organizations who've said, I would just want this inside because we might not be able to tie all those systems, but I want this person to take a little more ownership for their responsibility.
Do you see leadership development as an appropriate topic for piloting this application?
Yeah. So he asked if we'd see leadership development piloting this. And definitely. I think leadership is a perfect place to do this, partially because I don't know why leadership gets so separated from learning and development so often. It's kind of baffling to me because we're all trying to help people get better. There seems to be this select set that gets way higher paid consultants to come talk to them. So yeah, leadership would be perfect because it's got so many soft skills to it. People are, there's no real game, there's no specific way that that has to be done. You know, people are going to develop as they're going to develop, so just giving them a way to track what they're doing so that even the people trying to help them learn how to lead better can have some sort of data to work with. Because right now it's very much observation, mentoring. It's not, you know, you have to kind of be around them to know what's going on. And as soon as you're in a person's space, they're conscious of you, and you're not going to get the most even data from that.
Gentleman in the front here.
Just remembering the adopters list you showed earlier, I wonder if it's significant at the moment that Adobe, Google, Microsoft, and so on are not on it.
Yeah, that's true. Well, Adobe isn't there because Captivate 7 just released their support last week and we made that graphic 3 weeks ago. So they should be on there. Google, Microsoft, I'm not allowed to say things about specific people too often if I know something about them, but there's rumblings there, and they're big rocks to move. And it's not like you're going to see Google come out with full Google app support for Tin Can tomorrow. But you know, we've done things like take the Hangouts app and go into the developer sandbox and make that make statements. So we have a little prototype app right now where you can load a Hangout and it'll make a statement about everybody who attended that Hangout with a specific ID, so you can just collect who came there. So you're going to see a lot of things like that. And Google's Course Builder, another one of the adopters, took that and made it make statements about who was doing specific things in a course. So we can't exactly put Google's logo up, partially because we've taken this on from the bottom level, not from top down. But there are a lot of pieces there that can work.
Right at the back there.
I've been interested in e-portfolios for a few years. And I know they're mainly talked about in education. But do you think that the personal data locker is sort of the latest sort of approach to e-portfolio, but maybe for a more commercial corporate market?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you could view LinkedIn kind of as a digital resume, right? And an e-portfolio goes a little bit beyond that. So Tin Can definitely fuel the e-portfolio type of thinking, and especially when you get into standards for industries like nursing competencies and pieces like that. An e-portfolio, having that stuff in there and sending Tin Can data in as evidence is a great way to create this really rich profile of what you have done and can do.
There was another gentleman just behind the partitions there.
I can see it being put into every car, so then you can track people's behaviour and speed and things like that. But my question is, technically, what language are they using then to look through, write the statements? What's the skill set of the developer that you need to employ in order to be able to help you to link it all up?
Yeah, so there's two sides. The activity provider side is the one who makes the statements. The learning record store side is the one who collects the statements. So the skill sets are very different between those two for the developer who's going to build them. The activity provider side is actually fairly easy. The statements are in JSON. It's a RESTful API that uses JSON, which will make sense to a developer who knows APIs. Actually making the statements come out of things, though, is fairly easy. We have a bunch of open source libraries out there right now for JavaScript and Java and .NET and iOS, Objective-C. And they could use those to pull them down and just try and make statements now. Now, if you're going to have a ton of places in application make statements, that will be a little time consuming. But a pretty solid front-end developer could do this stuff fairly easily. The learning record store side is really complex, and there's a lot of things to consider. There's not an exact map in the specification of what to build when. It's basically a series of rules and APIs. So it needs to follow these rules, it needs to use these APIs. The storage structure you use, you know, Mongo, whatever you choose, that's totally up to you. The language of the programming to actually make it work is totally up to you. So it's really complex, but what we've done, we did that for a reason, in order to future-proof it. Because if we say you have to use this database structure today, you know, in 5 years, that's going to be totally outdated. So rather than have people locked into these structures, we said, use whatever you want to use, but it still has to do all these things and follow these rules.
This one there, please.
So each organization has its own data structure, its own information being tracked. You have employees moving around. In an optimist world, they're taking the records with them.
Mm-hmm.
How do we make sure that 6,000 employees later, we don't have a very big, solid chunk of inconsistent data?
Yeah, so deciding what data beyond the spec level data to track is a big question to ask, especially when you're going to implement. So the statements have a set of required data in those 6 elements I was talking about, the actor, the verb, the object. You have to track things in a certain way in those, but you can extend them to add extra data that's important to you. Now, if you decide to track a bunch of extra data that you change your mind about 6 times, you're going to have, the high-level structure is still going to match everything else. The structure below that, the pieces you've added on, could get very messy. In the tin can spec, also, things like verbs can be identified. You know, you can say, this verb means this, and this is the identifier for it. You can pick your own verb. It's not a set list you're locked into. But doing that smartly, it needs to be done with the community. And that's one of the things we kind of agreed upon early on with all the adopters was, we're all going to share when we coin a verb. So we're all using the same identifier for the verb. That way we don't end up with the verb attempted being identified 6 different ways, so it doesn't make sense to all of the systems. If we all identify it the same way, then it will make sense across the board.
Gentleman there.
So some of the key challenges there are a lot of systems in there, especially, well, not especially the LMSs, but the LMSs being the biggest pieces we've worked on so far. And that's what we've done for 10 years at Rustici Software is do SCORM support in LMSs, right? So getting either going into their software and doing it for them or having them work with us, there's some challenges to getting everybody on board. Another one of the challenges is deciding what to track, which is kind of why I repeated a few of those points, because what to track is really the hardest part of implementing this.
Where's the protection in terms of the individuals who are being tracked and what ends up potentially going into the locker or or anything like that in terms of that organisational knowledge? Does that individual know what's being collected about them?
They should be made aware of it, in my opinion. Now, the specification doesn't go into the ethics of using this. I think that every organization needs to say, here's what we're tracking and here's why. The protection in the tin can spec is that authentication is, you know, it's very strong. We use OAuth and all these other things to make sure that your data won't get hacked and pulled out, assuming the LRS is built well, which is something you always have to think back on is the organization owns that piece of software. They're going to stand it up how they're going to stand it up, but people could get in there if it's not done well. But I really do believe that organizations need to be very upfront about what they're tracking and why, not only to be fair, but to engage you in the process. Because if they care enough to track these things because they have a mission, then you're going to realize that is something really important to them, which is why tracking everything makes nothing important to them.
Right in the front here.
Related question. Does anybody ever think of Stasi? And if so, how do you prevent them doing so? What do you do to preempt them having a bad view of this? And it's related to the previous question.
Having a bad view of tin can, or?
Yeah, it's a wonderful, marvelous system. I can see that, but it must have some unfortunate connotations.
Yeah, there's, people are gonna think what they're gonna think, you know? Some people aren't ready for it. That's okay. I mean, some of us will push forward, others of us may stay in waiting for a long time, others may spend a lot of their time rallying against it. And one unfortunate thing there is that the Department of Defense will push it forward whether or not people like it because they're pushy. So it's going to move through military, at least, and some of those other branches, in the US at least. I think there are a ton of opportunities here which tend to, especially the being able to tie performance to learning, that will win people over in the end. But yeah, there are people who don't like it, and that's okay. You don't have to like it.
One there.
Another related question. Have the NSA been
It's the Department of Defense. So I haven't heard anything from the NSA specifically on this, but you've got to assume they're all talking to each other in the Pentagon, right? But it's funny because I got that question last week too. And you know, there's nothing built in the spec to specifically allow them to hack your LRSs, but if they figure it out, they figure it out. If people hand it over, they hand it over, you know? It's just the same idea of being conscious about what you're putting data into.
It also goes back to the consent idea, doesn't it? That they raised before. Anything identifiable, you don't need to max my consent to do it. Things like, you know, identifying that I have or how you use the soap dispenser in somewhere. That, I think, absolutely legally has to have my consent to do that.
Right.
Like
And
organizations capture data, not necessarily to do with the software or the specification to put together.
yeah, so luckily Vanderbilt is not tracking exactly who's using how much soap. They're just tracking that soap has been used. Because at some point you just don't want to know that many details about bathroom habits. So yeah, there's you know, well, when you work for an organization, right? I always have an assumption of respect for me from the organizations I'm working for, otherwise I won't work for them. And I understand many people don't always have the option of that. They have to work there because they have to work there. I think employers are going to, I think people knowing about this as the employees in the organization are going to become more vocal, and they're going to get more pushback than they're getting now. I know the privacy laws for data are much more protective of people over here than they are in the US, so that's definitely a consideration to take in, because in the US, an organization can collect all this data about you and sell it to marketers. It's totally fine. You have no claim to that. Here, it's a little different. So luckily, they're still going to have to follow your data privacy laws, no matter if they're using tin can or not.
Yes, Lee, right in the front.
AICC have announced that they are coming in behind tin can.
Yeah.
What exactly are they doing? And
Yeah.
when will they publish?
Yeah. When? I don't know. But so what she was saying is AICC's CMI5 spec, which is the successor to the last version of AICC, is being worked on. And they've come on with tin can using it as the runtime for their specification. So they're going to take over this world of packaging content and putting it in LMSs and advancing that. So there will never be another new version of SCORM ever. And tin can doesn't wholly replace SCORM. Tin can only replaces the part where the data moves from place to place. So AICC has taken on the other side of that in here's how content should be packaged, here's how it should be played, all those. It's actively in development. They meet weekly. It's just like tin can. You all could jump in and join if you have opinions about this. And hopefully next year for when, but you know, it'll take some time. And then getting that adopted will be a much longer curve than Tin Can, because Tin Can's fairly easy in comparison.
Has anyone used it with Salesforce?
There have, I think there's one use case that another company did where they're scraping Salesforce's API. So Salesforce hasn't natively adopted, but you can pull data from their API and translate it to Tin Can statements.
Oh, sorry. Well, I got you.
The fact that companies publish APIs like that, they haven't themselves got them, have they at all? As long as they make the data exposed, then it can be pulled in from them.
Well, you have to have permissions with their, so when you go to access their API, I believe Salesforce uses OAuth, which says, I am a credential provider. I am allowed to access this set of data. So it's still going through their authorization mechanisms.
Gentlemen. Oh.
One of the things that jumps out is there are no major LMS vendors in that list. And why do you think that is?
Well, there are a few who are working on it. There are also a few who are still on the fence waiting for demand from their customers. So if you have an LMS vendor who wasn't on that list, go ask them. The more we ask them, the closer we get to having it.
Okay, third time lucky there.
Tin Can only really for large organizations, and also the kind of organizations you presented mostly like medical or regulated organizations. What about the small and medium-sized organizations?
Yeah, so this is funny because Rustici software has never used a SCORM course or an LMS to train anybody ever, but we've supported that for 10 years. So we use it internally. We track our ping pong board with it and tie that to actual results in Zendesk. And we're a company of 20 people. So it can work for a very small company just because the owners are hands off. They assume people will go do their work as they should, and they can get some sort of analysis of how well people are doing or what's working or not working, but it's not an invasive way to do it. And we all know what's happening. So, you know, and we kind of are competitive in the office, so having the ping pong board with really good data is very important.
Oh, another one there.
I think I heard about one of the abilities that this would enable would be some kind of browser-based plugin where people could say, I've read this, for example, on the net. Does that exist now in that could I, as an individual, go and, you know?
Yeah. So go to watershed.ws, sign up. There at the top, you'll see a bookmarklet button. That'll walk you through installing it on your toolbar, and you can track things you read with that button. And you just click it, it says, I read this, and it grabs the name of the web page and the URL and some basic stuff. If you go onto the Tin Can site, you can actually download the code for the bookmarklet and modify it to do whatever you want with it, because it's open source, it's out there to play with.
Okay, so it would point to that specific bookmarklet, would point to the Watershed.
Yeah, it would point to your personal learning record store. Yeah. And everything on there is private. There are public statements, but we've set it up so it's just Rustici employees are public, so nobody has to worry about where statements are going.
Okay. Okay. Oh, yeah. Right at the back here.
Do you have any specific examples of how the Department of Defense are using?
I wish I did. They have built some prototypes with it. Mostly it's the ADL Research Initiative who's been involved in this. So they have built some prototypes like we've built some prototypes. Internally, I don't know exactly what they're doing. They have what they call the training and learning architecture, which Tin Can is a piece of. The other pieces are personal learning assistance, competency maps, which will be built in the future. Just Tin Can's this first step towards this well-named TLA, which might stand for three-letter acronym.
Oh, yes, right.
It seems to me that SCORM has the benefit of being a pretty objective piece of software. It records what you have done in simple terms. As soon as you get into the Tin Can arena, you are looking for perhaps a higher degree of trust, a more positive culture.
think it is a fair comment. I think we're, with the pace of how fast, or with the rate of change we're seeing and how fast things move in the economy, I think the forward-thinking organizations have adopted things like informal learning and pieces like that already. The learning department, in order to get more support around those, needs to show the value of them. So this is why this is working. And there's no good way to do that right now. So I think the organizational culture that allows you to make these big steps in general will also be the same one who's going to end up surviving in this economy and supporting people well and using this well. So it's kind of my theory of which businesses won't survive long, but I really do believe that the good ones will win in this. And I might just be an optimist. It's okay.
You mentioned that the generating tin can statements is a relatively simple thing to do. The difficult piece is the LRS at the other end. Are we seeing already people sort of presenting LRS as a software as a service?
Yeah. So if you think about that, if you go to the site, if you go to the adopters list, click LRS, you'll see there's a number of vendors there. So in our SCORM cloud, which is one of our products, there's a hosted LRS inside of that. Wax LRS has a hosted LRS, and vTraining Room also has a hosted LRS. And there's a new one, it's called Clear. You'll see it on the list, and there's links to the sites on there too. So. So it's like getting the data back out and filtering, maybe? Yeah. There's a little bit of work going on there. It's kind of the chicken and the egg. Before you can get much out, you have to have enough in there to make it worth getting out. There are some companies who have built some reporting. One of the things we help people do in installing LRSs is building that layer that pulls the data to a place where it's easy to build reporting from. Because if you're constantly pounding the LRS, which is doing 25 things at once, for this data, you're going to have really slow visualizations, really slow reporting. So, and there's a limited amount of ways that you can ask the LRS for data back. So if you say, this is the data that's going to be important, and then you build your reporting around that, like a lot of people have done simple things like put them in SQL or, you know, just get the data somewhere easy to find. One of the people I've been talking to is working with RapidMiner, which is an open source data mining software. So they're working on ways to get it in there. There's nothing really reportable there yet, but it's an idea that's being worked on.
Okay. Just as a matter of interest, making the assumption that everybody who's come to this presentation is interested in applying tin can, how many people have actually sort of got an application in mind that they think they might be able to apply to tin can? Any hands? 1, 2, yes. A few, yes. Yes, I can do that too. Interesting. So interest has started. So, excellent. Any more questions? Oh, one more, down front.
How much are the licenses likely to be, and how are they likely to, what's the pricing model for, say, an LRS, and is there an open source one available now?
Yeah, so pricing has kind of evolved. People have put out that they will have pricing models in the LRSs. A lot of the LRSs currently are, especially the software as a service LRSs, are still doing it for free. There's, I'm trying to remember, one of them added pricing recently per statement, I believe, or maybe it was per verb. People are figuring out how to price this. You know, you put out a new technology, a new class of software, and people will do a lot of things before they settle on a common way that it's done, which is why I'm even unsure. We actually don't charge for our hosted LRS. And all of the people who are building installed ones that I've worked with have been doing it on a per user fee. So there's a lot of squishiness there too. how you can convince somebody to help you work with TinCan. And I think you asked about applications too, activity providers.
No, you said
Oh, yeah. ADL has an open source LRS available on GitHub. It hasn't been updated since the 0.9 spec, I believe, or 0.95. So, and it's not a full LRS. There are some pieces missing now with the updates to the spec. So you could go pull that down and play with it, but I wouldn't use that for a production level thing right now.
If you don't charge for it, what other activities are paying for it?
Well, currently, it's the goodwill of the community, because we wrote this spec, we wanted to get it out there, and a lot of people have done the same thing where they put a bunch of money behind it because they believe it needs to exist, which is why there will be pricing that just hasn't kicked in yet. But, you know, right now most people are digging into their own pocket to pay for it, so it's not actually generating revenue yet.
Okay, right. Well, we've come to end of time. A reminder that Megan's workshop starts in half an hour, track 4, in case you need to know even more, which I'm sure you do. But meanwhile, please applaud Megan.